Is there a new link for the YouTube?
It'll pop up on the top, I believe. Once it's going live, you'll see it, and then you'll be able to get it from there.
Okay.
Here we go. Yep. Do you see it? Do you see the link at the top, the live on YouTube? Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right, you guys are all set. Good luck, and
How do I
we'll
stop
see
you from
soon.
being host, Victor?
Yes, let me switch you back. I can switch
Okay.
you back.
Okay. Great.
Okay. All right.
Anna,
See
you
you guys
look-
later.
You and Lauren look lovely. I'm sure Shenbo does too, but
Thank you.
Oh, Victor, hello.
yeah, Victor was doing the honors today.
Oh, thank you so much, Victor.
Well, I thought the morning session went well. I have a feeling that the afternoon session will undoubtedly have a different personality. I think it always is the case. But I am looking forward to meeting Susan Jones and seeing everyone else.
Yeah. Judy, do you use gallery view or do you use speaker view?
I use gallery view typically.
So if you click speaker view really quick and check out my screen, I don't know if you noticed this, but up in this.
Oh, it's Madam Architect. Uh-huh.
Of course, the whole reason why I'm in this unit.
Well, isn't that sweet? It's been, I did the interview a couple months ago before all of this, but I must have gotten notes from like 100 people. It's great. It's sweet.
Yeah, it's really phenomenal. It was a great article.
Well, it was a different era. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear about that. I think I'm leave and just check on the other like the live streams.
Yeah, is the undergraduate thesis review going on right now? Is that what I heard?
Yeah, so we're on channel 3. Undergrads are on 2 and grads are on 1.
Well, I'm certainly not going to be reviewing YouTube for the next 2 hours. I think I have other things that are more pressing. But are all the UGrad reviews on today?
I think they're half this afternoon and half tomorrow afternoon.
Oh, so I'll check out some tomorrow because I feel very disconnected from that whole process. I've been on grad reviews, but not undergrad.
Yeah.
Are they keeping, because I've looked at some of tried to find videos after they're passed, and I don't think they're there unless I'm doing something wrong. So are they just being live streamed and then taken down?
So after the live stream, I've been making them private because
Okay.
I think the faculty needs to have a conversation about like distributing.
What to do with them?
Because like if a student cries in their review,
Oh, yeah.
like it's there and people are there, but like I don't know, I'm not really sure if that should be publicly and stuff like that. Or
Does
like
that happen anymore? I thought that was the old days.
it happens.
No.
And like if a reviewer says something that might be a little bit inappropriate or stuff like that, so I think there's someone should review and like I don't know. I think it's
Right. That makes sense.
keep it private. It's probably better.
But you guys who are doing thesis, you need to see the thesis reviews.
I think thesis will be public.
Mhm.
All right, I'll be right back.
All right, bye. Hi, Chris.
Hello, how are you guys today?
Oh, we're great. We're happy that the end is in sight. At least I am. I don't know about the students. The students probably would rather have another few weeks of Zoom studio, right? Wrong. I am sick of sitting in front of my computer, staring at a
I would
small
agree with you there. Yeah.
Chris works with Shauna. She was great this morning. I really appreciated her comments.
I was over like intermittently hearing some things, but I was also on a bunch of Zoom calls this morning trying to wrap some things up for the University of Miami, and so I was kind of hearing a little bit of the conversation. So it sounded like it was good.
Yep, it was great. So we need to, of course, wait for the, our other guests, and then I'll do introductions, and then I'll do an introduction, the same one I gave this morning for the reviewers, so that they know what on earth we've been up to.
It sounds good. I did read the stuff you sent over, which was great to see. So
Terrific.
exciting.
Hi, Raphael. So since I have most of the students here, I don't want to do a long session after our review today, but so maybe it's probably best if I sent you an email with you know, deadlines and places to post things. Hi, Jim.
Yo.
He's getting it. You know, it's one of the tricky things about these Zoom reviews is that you don't get to chat with the reviewers very much. You don't get to have lunch with them or a follow-up conversation. But it's good to see you, Jim.
Hi, Judy.
Hi, Corey.
Hi.
You have the official looking headset too. And then I think Susan Jones is going to join us as well, but I have no idea what time it is in, well, in Seattle, it probably is a reasonable hour, you know, like.
So, Judy, we've been having virtual cocktail parties. You've been having those down there?
Not enough. But I have been observing a 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock cocktail ritual.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Independent of that. I'm sure the students haven't. They are all into clean living.
Oh, good students. Clean living in New Orleans. How can that be?
Well, actually, it's a little unlikely, isn't it?
Yeah.
They didn't go to Tulane because they were going to a Bible Belt. That wasn't the calculus that they were engaged in. Little did they know that they wouldn't get a traditional Tulane graduation, they are amazing.
Oh, really? Oh.
They pull out all the stops. They tend to get really well-known speakers, which is one thing, but then they also have music and lots of festivities. But you guys are going to have one in the fall. Is that the plan for the? We'll see. We don't know. Well, are you done with your studio, Jim?
We finished last week. Although I have a seminar I have to finish up at the end of this week. So.
Yeah, we finish this week and then have meetings next week, etc. But then, oh, hello, Susan, and I love your backdrop.
It's somewhat relevant to the conversation. So
now, is this really your home? Are you sitting in that space, or is this a faux background?
This is really my home, Judith. I'm actually sitting in my bedroom, which is a little embarrassing bit, but I think there's probably one or two of us who are doing the same thing. No backdrop. Thank you for the invitation to this wonderful review.
Oh, well, thank you for joining us. And lovely to meet you in this context. So let me introduce everyone and then we can get started. I'll introduce the problem after I've introduced our visitors. Well, first I need to introduce Raphael Passarelli, who's my colleague in this endeavor. He's been, he's a visiting research professor here at Tulane, and he's been working on our urban build. It's a project where they, with another colleague, Byron Mouton, and a group of students, they build a small 3-bedroom stick-built house that they design in the fall, and then they build it and finish it in the spring. And I believe that they just finished it, except that IKEA won't deliver any cabinets because they're closed. But, so Raphael, Raphael, your review is tomorrow, right?
Yeah, they just finished the construction today, and today they should be taking pictures now, photos. For
They're
tomorrow.
going to do a fly-through review of some sort, but tomorrow. But Raphael has a PhD in timber, in mass timber from the University of Tokyo, and has been working in Japan on mass timber projects. So he's been with us 1 day a week as the students and I improve our knowledge of this amazing and really rather different in terms of how we typically think about building system. And so he's been great to have. And so our visitors today include Jim Garrison, who has a distinguished practice in New York and is also a professor of practice, I believe, at Pratt, and is the author of one of the precedents that we looked quite closely at, the disaster relief prototype for the city of New York that he won in a competition and then built. And then if you look on his website, you see an amazing array of modular projects, all exquisitely detailed and look really expensive too, but that's our separate thing. So he has enormous expertise in that arena. And of course we have Susan Jones, who is the principal of Atelier Jones and who is also a professor of practice, I believe, at University of Washington, right? Where you teach Fairleaf?
Adjunct associate professor, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, you are the author of another one of our precedents, not in terms of modularity, but in terms of timber. And she's sitting in that room, Maddie, that you analyzed. Your insights and expertise will be incredibly valuable to us today. We also have Corey Saft, who is a little bit upriver, well, it's not quite upriver, north of us in Lafayette, Louisiana. And he's a professor there and runs a practice, but is very involved in sustainable design and including timber themes, and is certainly familiar with our regional issues, let's put it that way. And of course, Chris Meyer, who is an assistant professor at University of Miami, works with Shauna Meyer, who you met this morning, but who is running a research grant, was awarded a research grant from the Woodworks Council on timber innovation, and is working hard to bring a focus of wood into Miami, where it might feel like a little bit of a foreign material in the world of concrete. Is that accurate, Chris?
I think that's very accurate, particularly for our situation here in South Florida, which shouldn't be the case, but it is.
Yeah. Well, it's I know Miami has its own set of challenges, environmental challenges that no one can ignore. So Marianne Damaris, who was going to be with us today, had to be pulled away, so she will not be joining us. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully the right way. I always do it the wrong way, and then students, my team here, alert me to the fact that I have failed, but oh, let's see, view. All right, can you see it? Is it?
Yes.
Great.
You can see it.
Yay. Okay, so I thought I would set the stage for you, and I shared these images, and this will be very brief, but to share with you the process of this studio. Well, the impetus for me was that our dean, our new dean, Inaki Alde, initiated a series of research studios, a focus on studio as a part of a research topic dealing with research questions. And I thought back to a set of experiences I had recently and thought that this might be an interesting thing to explore and to bring the theme of mass timber into Tulane, where it had not resided. But a number of years ago, Tiffany Lynn and I won a competition for a disaster relief prototype using steel structural insulated panels. It was a kit house, and we later built it with the sponsor of the competition, and it certainly brought made clear to me the challenges of kit construction, but also the challenges of that particular set of materiality in a disaster relief setting. And then a couple of years ago, I taught a studio on a 3,000 acre piece of property in rural Mississippi, where pine plantations and hunting and were the prime activities on this very rural and under-resourced part of the world. So bringing those two things together was sort of the impetus of this studio. We began by looking at a number of research issues associated with southern pine, but for forestry broadly, but also southern pine and mass timber. The map that you're looking at shows the forests before complete deforestation, which occurred in the succeeding years. And so as the quote indicates, much of the zone of southern pine had been logged out and was now residing in the homes of New Orleans and in the construction of many other parts of the world. But those acres were replanted over the last 75 or 100 years. And now there's far more forest. It's cited here, 2 million to 32 million. And it is a growing resource, not a diminishing resource. But there are, of course, still challenges. And as many of you are aware, mass timber production had been located in Canada and the Pacific Northwest, as well as in Europe. But recently there's been a plant opened up in Dothan, Alabama, another one planned for Texas, and another for Arkansas, using southern pine. So this is an enormously important thing for our region, which has historically been economically tied to extraction industries of oil and gas, and with very little interest in carbon themes. So clearly the confluence of this amazing natural resource and the amazing and critical challenges of the Gulf Coast, both in terms of climate, but also in terms of the economy, are sort of part of this. So this slide shows some of the research that the students did, both in terms of understanding carbon sequestration, looking at various species and their coverage, also on silviculture. And we also looked at some economic issues, which I think are, of course, studio and architecture is not going to get as deeply into the economics as one wants to, but it's an important thing to be aware of. Most of these forests are privately held. For mass timber in this area to be an appropriately environmental activity, these need to be very carefully managed and sustainably managed and certified. But there also has to be a market, because this area, the timber broadly, but certainly in the Gulf South, by looking at the stumpage prices, you can tell that it's an industry that is extremely vulnerable to economic swings. So people may plant their pine forest, 50 years or 40 years earlier and have no idea what kind of return they're going to get on their investment when it comes time to harvest it. So the hope is that mass timber, when it becomes more widely used, when incentives to make it more widely used start to exist, that it could help to stabilize some of those swings. We also, of course, looked at prototypes, both installation scale prototypes of plywood, mass plywood, as well as mass timber. And of course, I think at the time, the only house made of CLT in the US, Susan's house in Seattle. The Maison Domino, of course, is not mass timber, but is a nice image to include anyway. It's wood. So the first exercise that we did was a way of beginning to understand the system compared to the sort of iconic structural prototypes that we're more familiar with. So we took some concrete houses, some steel houses, and even a couple of stick-built houses, and first went through an exercise of translation, direct translation, and then eventually transformation through the lens of fairly rigorous dimensional lens of using mass timber, understanding it structurally, and then in the last stage, one had license to make it really quite different than the original house. Although I think the two examples, this is from Campo Beza, a house in Spain, and this is a house by Sue Fujimoto, in a house in Tokyo. Both of these houses probably do retain a certain fairly legible allegiance, although transformative in terms of many material aspects to their original analysis. We also had a couple of really, really helpful guest lecturers, people who, friends who came to New Orleans, gave lectures, sat in on crits, and shared their knowledge with us, which I think I can speak for the students in saying that they were really, really valuable. Chung, who was the lead architect on the UMass project, but also the Arkansas dormitories with Lears Weinzapfel, and Judith Shine, who is directs the Tallwood Institute in Oregon, the director of design. So in thinking about why mass timber in the Gulf South, there are those issues, but there's certainly inherent in the material, there's the issue of time and how, if you're going to sequester carbon, how you manage to keep it sequestered for an adequate duration, how you begin to deal with all aspects, both the technical and the biological aspects of forestry, and thinking about the life cycle issues. But I was struck by a sort of analogy in the history of our city. Throughout the 19th century, particularly the first half of the 19th century, people in the Ohio Valley farmers would build these boats out of 2x12 pieces of oak from the forest. And those boats were designed to go down the river and never make it back up. They were dismantled and the lumber was sold, and our city was built out of that. And so many of the early houses in Louisiana, probably broadly Louisiana, but certainly in New Orleans, were barge board construction, 2-inch thick walls, no insulation, with cladding on the outside, no frame. And so that still exists in parts of our city, but it's certainly an example of a resource that has now been intact and in use for over 100 years, so well over 100 years. So it seems like a theme that can be seen in contrast to the situation that has occurred in recent disasters in our area, where these mobile units end up scrapped after a year of use, maybe sold for a pittance, and whose material qualities are not necessarily healthful or certainly not environmentally. So we did some, so the second project, so after all of that analysis and research, we, right around the midterm, we started this disaster relief prototype study. And so we initiated it with analysis of both small scale modular and flat pack units and larger aggregates of flat pack and modular units, mostly European. And so we did that analysis, and then the students were asked to develop both a prototype, but also a scenario that takes into account this issue of initial use, reuse, and themes of time, as well as material. You'll see that we scratched the physical model off that list because by the time we really got into this exercise, we were in post-COVID remote teaching mode. And so the themes of this, of the studio originally were intended to be economic. We were intending to do rather specific costing of these. And so there was a desire for some quantitative analysis, but it became pretty clear that that wasn't going to be, aside from the fact that it would be difficult to do it accurately, no way is CLT going to win a cost benefit analysis. Well, maybe a cost analysis, arguably a benefit analysis, possibly. And so that we did go through the carbon calculator for the various modules that people created. And in a sense, through this analysis, it's valuing quantity in a way that usually you try to make buildings efficient by minimizing the amount of materials you use. But through this calculus, you're in a way creating an approach which values mass. And that seriously upends the equation that was prevalent in much of the early part of the first part of the 20th century, and arguably in some contexts today. But it certainly brings a series of questions into play about what the metrics for, beyond the design metrics that we associate with quality of space, et cetera, but in terms of what the metrics of cost, what the metrics of benefit are, and brings a whole series of questions into play, which I suspect will come up today. So that's my slide share. And if I can figure out how to stop that, I will invite, we're going to look at 4 projects. We looked at 4 this morning as well. And if you're interested later, I can share with you a link on the other projects that you won't be looking at this afternoon. But I believe Lauren is going to start us off.
Yes. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
I think I better turn my little bell off.
All right, so my concept was movable urbanism. And so when thinking about this material CLT and disaster relief scenarios, I really tried to focus on how people can be relocated swiftly and how this material can be used over spanning timelines of short, midterm, and long-term solutions to disaster relief. So when looking at the short-term needs for mass housing, the timeline and occupancy were very important factors to consider. Beyond immediate deployment, these relief units could also serve as long-term investments or until homes are renovated post-disaster. I chose working with a flat pack, which is what this diagram is, because it's more dignified than a disaster trailer, I believe. As Judy just showed, many of the materials aren't very healthful and a lot of them are just scrapped, which is very wasteful. So the unit intends to accommodate and adapt to everyday needs in every phase of disaster recovery. And that is what these 3 units show at different spaces. This next slide shows the approach of the 3 dwelling prototypes and how they're designed to be compacted or extended, depending on the occupant's needs or site restrictions. In regards to the assembly complexity, the CLT flat was chosen due to its reuse capabilities, as I said. And then long-term use presents opportunity for disaster victims to remain on their suburban properties and avoid complete displacement. For further ease of construction on short-term timelines, the wet module is brought on site separately as it is intended for modular reuse. And this kind of hybridized approach means that the unit does not necessarily need to be ordered specifically and can be fabricated precisely at various sizes. So this is the material breakdown of the CLT panels and just a short little spreadsheet showing how these numbers kind of influence the materials chosen to make it an affordable option for disaster relief. And it helped me to determine the development of the modules and how possible the changing of the structure in different phases of disaster recovery could happen. The panel dimensions is seen on the left, and the cuts are also important because it emphasizes that these simple panels have predetermined dimensions, which presents the opportunity for flexible construction. And these are the relocation sites that I kind of looked at for short-term and long-term. The disaster relief for short term is a parking lot and overlooked suburban properties, while long-term deployment would exist on residential lots, densifying the suburban area. These contextual scenarios I felt were important because many of the potential occupants cannot be further relocated as they still have their everyday responsibilities such as jobs. And to completely transplant disaster victims would separate them even more from their familiar resources and opportunities, which could, as a result, create more problems than it would solve. And then additionally, site limitations kind of include and require electricity, water, wastewater access, and site access from existing infrastructure for proper deployment. And now we're going to look at a couple of precedents because this is a more hybridized design. I use 3 different types of precedents in the development of this idea. And those are the module structure. On the left, you'll see the no-nonsense housing company, which really takes the idea of mobile and compacts it to roughly 200 square feet, meeting the basic dwelling necessities in a confined space and making it adaptable to many sites. And then the Airstream trailer was less of a precedent and rather a structural study to understand how the steel frame could connect to the CLT flat pack and have a changing ground condition. This is the flat pack precedence. On the left is Palm Springs Mobile Club. And what I took from this idea was more of the use of the land. So at the Palm Canyon Mobile Club, there is the opportunity to rent the land and own the home, which complements the contextual strategy of movable urbanism because it gives the occupant the opportunity to make a disaster recovery scenario into more of a long-term investment that can be relocated if desired. And then on the right is the Systems 3 house by Oscar Leo Kaufman and Albert Ruff. Here, it's just really the walls, floors, and ceiling elements that are made of solid wood slabs and use a CNC technology to cut open the windows that are prefabricated and then installed on site. So just that system of flat pack assembly. And then lastly of the precedents is Peter Zumthor's Zinc Mine Museum. And I chose that as a precedent for short to midterm exteriors because it's a water resistant membrane. And when approved for external use, this painted wood system can be used for up to 12 months without any degradation in natural light. And then on the interior, it's just an example of how that CLT can be shown and reduce costs and also provide an aesthetic. And here's an example of the facade transformation over time if this is to become a more permanent solution. The prefabricated wet module intends to serve short to long term, but if wanting a more permanent solution for a kitchen space and a bathroom, that can be changed to a structure with permanent CLT and then a similar cladding that exists on the CLT structure. So this right here is the plan. This is the 2-bedroom unit that's 350 square feet and 446 square feet with the wet module attached. And as you can see, that wet module holds a kitchen and a bathroom. And there's a slight gap between the CLT and the steel trailer, allowing for the expansion of the wood. And this is intended to accommodate a family of 3 comfortably with a full service kitchen and a full-size bathroom. And the windows were kind of thoughtfully placed so it could provide for privacy if this ends up being in that more public suburban space of a parking lot temporarily, or even if they're closer together on, say, permanently on a private lot that's turned into multiple. And then this is the unit section of that same 2-bedroom. And you can see that the roof slopes in front of a parapet, and that's for stormwater management. The roof is concealed and that roof slopes down into a gutter, which is released near the concrete piles. And to the right, you can see that drop ceiling in the wet module to handle the HVAC needs. This specific section shows the ground connection as the concrete piles and steel tubes, which is the more permanent solution that would also extend to the wet module if converted permanently. But in situations where the units are deployed in more public spaces, such as the parking lot where the soil is already compacted by car traffic, there's the option to use an easy pad, which is shown on the bottom right. And that's really for heavy duty foundation solutions that can be easily installed on compressed ground, but also so that these temporary lots are not disrupted from their intended use after the immediate disaster recovery period. These detail sections show the layers assembled on site. At the inner layer, this is the CLT, and it's exposed on the interior again to reduce the cost and provide an interior aesthetic similar to that of Susie by Oscar Leo Kaufman. And then following that CLT is the insulation and wood panel layer, which are fabricated together for ease of construction on site. And covering that wood paneling layer is a waterproofing paint that was talked about with Zumthor's Zinc Museum. The roof system is also a 3-ply covered with a similar rigid insulation and then waterproofing membrane, as the roofing is not visible from the ground. And these are the elevations that shows the waterproof cladding material with the attached furring strips for the final cladding layer, which, if determined as a long-term solution, would have a rain screen. And then there's that condenser shown on the exterior of the wet module to show how that HVAC system is incorporated throughout. And this is the final slide, and I chose it because of the beginning we talked about how it was used to assemble these disaster relief modules, but it also reveals how the flat pack and the wet module can be transported again for reuse as a trailer. And then that was the last slide, but I have a final video to show just to kind of further explain how it is assembled, each layer. And that's the wet module coming in on its own. Oops. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Lauren.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren. I'm happy to jump in if nobody else does. It's a real pleasure and a delight to see this studio unfold as a whole. I think the initial premises of the studio were really exciting for me to see. And I'm trying not to have my house included as part of that discussion, but just to see how the broader approach to the Southern Pine question in the South has been taken on and thoughtfully identified is really critical, because it's an emerging topic. And I've been on a couple of studios in the South, and it's not often gone into as much depth as into the forestry plantation questions and the carbon questions as you all have. So I was really excited to see that as a whole. Regarding the projects, it's just a delight, Lauren. This is a very thoughtful project. It seems very complete. There's a lot of care that's been taken. I was thrilled to see the wall sections, for instance, in the work there. And I guess if I had to start at a broader premise for your project, Lauren, I would have to question and ask you to expand upon the movable urbanism quality of your title. And maybe that's a bit of a red herring. Perhaps it got you into some difficulties that you didn't anticipate, but do you really think your project is movable? And perhaps you were getting at that with that last slide in the video, but if you could expand upon that topic, I would appreciate it, because there's a lot of very good permanent construction or semi-construction about the project that I could talk about, but it's the movability part has kind of got me questioning a little bit.
Okay, yes, that really had to do with the ground connection and thinking about how flat pack could be moved. It was really between flat pack and modular, where modular system could be placed on a truck and transported. But as a whole, it seemed a little bit more similar to maybe like a FEMA trailer, where that's less personal, and that's something that multiple families have gone through. So having like that same system that maybe you use in an actual disaster recovery scenario and having that brought to you was maybe deconstructed and then moved onto a different site was something that I considered was how this system would work. And here's that section that shows like how the ground connection would not affect that temporary placement in a more public lot. So thinking about more of how you're going to affect the space and how maybe that would be like an ease of transport.
That's helpful, Lauren. And the question of design for disassembly is a really key issue for mass timber advocates in this space. And I don't think we as a profession have completely analyzed that to the degree, because a lot of the carbon calculations depend on the end of life uses and the whole building analysis, LCA analyses. They really depend on being able to be reutilized in order to get that extraordinary bounce in carbon savings or GWPs from compared to concrete or steel, especially at larger scales. So one of the things I was like excited to see was maybe you're gonna bring it in as a flat pack, it's gonna get moved onto the site, but then you're gonna show me how you're gonna do some disassembly and the details are gonna come out and those screws are gonna come out and you're gonna draw some awesome diagrams, Lauren, to show the profession how to really do that and to document that in a clear way so that then you really can move this to another site. And I think it's the back end that of the movability that is the question, but I don't want to get us off on a tangent because it's a really nice project, Lauren, very well documented.
Thank you.
I agree. It is a very nice project, but just on that last comment, it seems like the basic formula to do any kind of long-term analysis is the length of service for this, as you make a point of. So it does become so important because when you start to think about something that the more material you use, the more carbon sequestration you're able to accomplish, and there's some kind of value in that, that gets cut off at the knees when it has unexpected ending points. And the Katrina Cottage is a clear example of that. There was no thought about how to use it after the immediate emergency. And so we have parking lots full of those things. So certainly disassemble and reuse for its same purpose. It also seems like there's a real opportunity to just continue to add on to this, to think about how you're setting up. Okay, so maybe it's in the backyard of someone else's property, but also maybe it's on its own property and someone in an emergency situation could be gifted this or through some kind of service, and then be allowed over time as they reestablish their economic base to add on to that, to actually make this. Because the beauty of mass timber is the material is of such quality that it encourages one to hold on to it, to take care of it, to kind of last through that. So to find ways where you can tap into that unique quality of the material and capture the one thing that could be an unknown, which is the kind of super longevity of it.
Right, I definitely agree. I think the precedent of the Palm Springs Mobile Club, where I talked about you rent the land and you own the home, is definitely maybe a longer term solution that I didn't fully explore, but that's definitely an option with the square footage of these homes and building a community with them.
I think that from the standpoint of all the conversations up to this point, it seems like the majority of them are orbiting around a timeline. I think one of the first things you did say was idea timeline. So I think for a project like this, and I'm not for sure actually what level of student, what the kind of cross section of the studio. I believe it's an upper level studio. So this type of project for you guys could be ultimately a jumping off point as you depart your education and move out into the practice, where in some ways you can see this project play out in many different timelines. So there's a very short-term timeline for it. There's a very long-term timeline for it. There's also a timeline that's maybe a bit adjustable, in which it's broken into fragments as what's being said, where it's reused or put into other conditions. I think a project like this maybe deserves for you to spend a little time and give us ultimately a couple different scenarios in which this thing becomes much more powerful as a system of components to serve a very complicated urban strategy. The other thing that's brought into this particular discussion is that you guys are seemingly putting this together for the Gulf South, and ultimately the Gulf South, all the way around the Horn up into New York, is ultimately going to face a very turbulent time as we move forward with our urbanism. And what I think is interesting about these types of strategies within the Gulf South around up into the Eastern Seaboard is that what we find is that these particular buildings offer us some mobility, flexibility in terms of our urban strategies, which aren't stuck in heavily static and essentially overcommitted building types. So the buildings, in some ways, it's not that we want to sit here and think about movable cities, but I think the idea of movable city for you is a very fascinating component when you think about portions of it being able to be uprooted without an overcommitment to our material embodied energies and commitment to their resource extraction. And that's a very exciting moment. And I would push you to see this project as one avenue to think about many different timelines, which could be applicable to different cities that have different agendas for their futures, which is, I think, why I'm interested in wood for Florida, which isn't necessarily the right approach, but we have to question the role of our buildings within the larger context of how long a city can and will exist within a very turbulent environmental scenario.
Right. And that's a conversation that extends beyond disaster relief too.
It does seem like the movable idea of your urbanism is, at least the way I'm starting to think about it, is to always have a plan B. You know, that when shit hits the fan, when something goes wrong, this thing has the capacity to rearrange itself, reconfigure itself. Might not be easily movable, but it's certainly movable in some time frame.
Right.
Which I think would question some of the assemblies for the insulation. And I think when you look at the entirety of the project, I think you have this thing like really close in a way. You have like the mentality that the architecture is in some ways flexible. You have it essentially as architecture is assembled into an urbanism, if you will, that is now more nimble. But I think you have to go back to the materiality a little bit and try to push on some of those components that are maybe problematic to the balance of embodied energy and the high grade energy materials that are essentially unable to be reused once they've been deployed. And a lot of those happen to be the insulations. So if the kind of scale of materiality or the architectural form making might have an agenda that's much grander within the context of its full assembly deployment, I think you might find that the insulation is now your target.
I think that's a really great point, Chris, because once you start really digging into that idea of disassembly, it's not just about the connections between these big, sturdy mass timber panels that you're showing, but when you have to attach that, typically a mineral wool, which goes screw based into the mass timber, there's a lot of penetration that happen also in the waterproofing detail. So all of that has to come off. And yet at the same time, you still need that to protect the weather from the weathering of the mass timber itself. And I think it's interesting if this climate of the South doesn't necessarily, it needs protection from the rain, but there may be some less insulative qualities that are necessary. You know, I don't know the boundaries of those parameters, but they could be applied to this as a local case study of how the South with its Gulf streams of weather and hurricanes, and you need to take these FEMA shelters, CLT FEMA shelters, and move them here from Houston to New Orleans to somewhere else, then, you know, is there a way to rapidly disassemble these in an exciting way that really does make it movable? Because I want to believe you, but I don't get the connection here. What I'm seeing right now, Lauren. I'm convinced. And it's a lot of these questions. That beautiful skin that you talked about with Zoom Tour, you could also just say, I'm going to take really cheap building paper and just wrap the whole thing that then can be taken off. And there's a tiny bit of carbon that's lost from that rather than losing all of this really elegant, beautiful skin that you've detailed.
You know, Susan, there's a very interesting dynamic here. I think as I listen to everyone and I think about our own reaction to these things, this architecture that we're asking Lauren to consider, it's very, very conditional, right? It has many goals, let's say, and some of them compete with one another, some of them reinforce, but it is an architecture that's determined by externalities. It's a really funny thing. I mean, we run into this quite commonly. You're trying to do so many things. Can you make a building that is demountable? Can you make a building that's high density? Can you make a building that is carbon sequestering? Can you make a building that is at the same time permanent? I mean, permanent because we want to invest the material in the material that we're fabricating from. It's being asked to do so many things. right? And I think it's it's an extremely difficult challenge, and maybe an impossible one in the end. There are things that push back, right? I mean, what we found in our research on post-disaster housing over the years is that it's usually never relocated, and it usually establishes new communities with new dynamics that people are loath to give up. And it's a really funny thing. I mean, once you put one of the things that we've come to believe is that when we consider a post-disaster community, we have to consider it with the expectation that it probably will never be removed, because the overwhelming majority of them never are. So now how do you design under those conditions? Who are, you know, this goes back to this business of a conditional architecture. Who are you satisfying, right? What requirements really matter? So it's a very interesting condition. The one thing that I would say is most, that I could be, I love the tectonics and the development of many of the ideas. I love your idea about hybridization. It's all really clever and great. The one thing I would be very critical of is the idea of community and how these things can be assembled to reinforce a kind of identity and movement between them that it is. I would look for something that's higher density, that has some of the kind of connectivity of a kind of denser urbanism. And I think you could do that. I think it's well within your system, but I think that would be a real goal and something to add on to the, you know, 50 goals that are already in place, you know.
Those of you, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that that's the nature of the timeline, which is very exciting. And I think that it allows for maybe one or two of these moments to be explored without them being shackled to too many agendas. And I think it's a great point that you made in terms of how much can we really ask of this architecture. So at the time, I think I would point to interrogating the timeline relative to the objectives and intentionalities of the work, and maybe very much limiting it to only trying to solve or approach one or two types of goals. And from that point, maybe you have some freedom and flexibility to say you don't have to address some of these conditions, and it maybe gives you some leeway to develop a couple inventive or exploratory types of scenarios, which I think is actually helpful in school, like where you're free and unshackled from that. So I'd take advantage of that as much as possible.
I'd
Yeah,
agree.
you're going to see a few different approaches to this, obviously, because the issues that you've all brought up are have been confronted by everyone in a variety of ways. I was trying to imagine how you could strap the insulation on without having to screw it in with these big sort of barrel vaults of things that you could do on 16-inch centers or something. But in any event, if there aren't any more comments, we can move on, or if there are some other thoughts before we do.
I have just a couple kind of more detailed thoughts. If we go back to the wall section.
Yes.
So it seems like your parapet's built out of the insulation.
Yes.
That seems like it might have some. Yeah.
Okay.
And the platform framing of certainly the floor system, it seems like just how that's attached. If it is like that, it'd probably be some kind of some more steel in there than the nails and screws.
Okay.
And the last thing is the water management. It seems like there's some more opportunity that you have this single pitch sloped roof to collect all the water into one location. And if that was reversed, where that actually went to your wet center, and the roof of that was some kind of cistern-like collection system, both to slow down when there's heavy rain, so it doesn't immediately go into whatever system it's going into. And also just have it up there as a gravity-fed system for any number of other kinds of activities. And you're already kind of working with water in that area. So in a way, make the roof of that its own gutter system.
Okay, that's
Give
great.
you some
That's
opportunity.
an interesting idea. I love that.
Because we had it sloping to the shorter end, but we eventually decided to maybe cover the entire roof with parapets and go to gutter. So that's a good idea. I didn't consider that.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's good.
Well, we can move on. By the way, I was going to share because I never did share this. This group of students is a mix between fourth year undergraduates who will be continuing in the program next year as fifth year BARC students. And then we have about a little less than half our final semester graduate students who are, for whom this is their last formal studio. So, okay, so I believe the next person is Ryan, is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, great.
I'm Ryan, as Judith has mentioned already. The objective in my project was just to initially just to create a one-bedroom module that can be immediately deployed in place of FEMA trailers. So getting into the unit, I wanted a unit that would work with standard CLT panel sizes, and also a unit that could be transported very easily. This at 10-foot transportation width, you would be able to, you wouldn't need any special requirements or oversized load to transport this to the site. I felt that it was important to increase that to 12 feet because I'm thinking about these units as a little bit more permanent solution, and 10 feet wide as a unit was just a little too slim as a suitable living condition. So I extended that out to 12 feet. I also created 2 different options of these units that rotate the openings to allow for a more unique aggregation system, so that you can take advantage of placing these horizontally and vertically. And then I'll zoom in here to the plans. Also carefully placing these apertures on the ends of the CLT panels highlighted in that tan color there, to optimize the CLT cuts and not using cutout windows that essentially waste the CLT panel. Into the elevation, I'm also utilizing, again, floor to ceiling windows to make that full cut rather than partially cutting out of a panel. And here into the section perspective of the unit, showing that this is the more vertically facing option that could even be allowed for some cross ventilation as well. Precedent, I was really inspired by the post-disaster prototype by Garrison Architects. Obviously, James Garrison is here. To me, I selected this as one precedent to look closely at because of the size of the units, as I specified earlier, were already made to be transported, and also the apertures and windows were already using floor to ceiling height windows, which when converting it to CLT, it really made sense to study this unit. And so looking into some different scenarios that this unit could be deployed, obviously could be deployed in a more singular fashion or in a row more row housing fashion, and then getting into more aggregated and stacked ideas. On the left, very similar scenario to the Garrison prototype, and on the right, utilizing those two different unit types to be able to maximize a little more irregularity in the aggregation. So getting into the fabrication, I was thinking of these units being assembled in a factory, not being a flat pack. Thinking about the post-disaster context of this project, I thought it was more important to have these units be ready to be shipped out, and really trying to minimize the construction process on site so that these modules, the deployment would be a lot quicker compared to a scenario where the project has to be built on the site. And then transportation, this module takes up about almost all the space that a truck could use with an oversized load, really taking advantage of pretty much all the space that can be offered with the transportation and utilizing the standard CLT panel sizes. So after that, I began to think about different sites or in context that these units could live in, because I think it's pretty, it's been pretty researched already that these could live in a standard lot. So I began to think of different sites. I landed on using Stadia due to the existing structure and existing facilities that already exist in a stadium, such as electricity and plumbing. And also we've seen these sites kind of become less used over time. After, there's a certain lifespan to these sites and in stadiums, and then kind of there's always a decision, what do you do after the stadium becomes vacant, essentially. So looking at some precedents that kind of convert stadiums into housing. This was a conceptual project done in Brazil. Brazil, obviously, there's a very large housing crisis throughout Brazil. And in 2014, they had the World Cup, which requires, I think, 10 or 12 stadiums to be built or renovated to fit the scale of the World Cup. So after that event, these stadiums really became vacant or very little used compared to the capacity that they can hold. So selecting a site within New Orleans, I decided to choose Tad Gormley Stadium in City Park for a few different reasons. One, because it is one of the few stadiums here that's not used by at least a professional sports team. It's really mostly used today for high school events. Two, the concrete structure of the stadium allows for more weight to be added on than maybe a steel structure. The third reason was this open-ended stadium and access around the stadium provides easy access for construction and entrance into the site. And then just some overall information. It's actually a state-owned stadium, and it was built during the Great Depression era by the Works Progress Administration. So thinking about how this stadium was once used to kind of get the economy going back during the Great Depression could again be used in a similar fashion after a disaster. So here is a video that shows the aggregation. So I started by focusing in on the entry points to the stadium, and then stacking these models on top of each other, as you see here, that allow for outdoor spaces and decks for units that are sitting on top of each other. And once I created a kind of standard grouping of these units, I then just kind of arrayed these around the stadium to fit that elliptical shape. I'll play this again real quick. So again, focusing in on that entry point and kind of building the group of these units around there, kind of in a sense, creating smaller communities inside a larger aggregation of these units. And then, as I said, arraying these around. And then the final phase is kind of transforming the field into a more communal area and an area that can be used for water management. I don't know why it's, hold on. For some reason I had trouble going to the next slide. All right, so into the site plan. In total here, there's 102 units. As you saw in the video, utilizing that circulation down the middle and trying to pull these off of the existing entry points within the stadium. Using this kind of vertical circulation through those entry points, and then horizontal circulation around on that kind of second tier of seats. And then again at the top, and then providing some stairs and elevators around that top circulation that can be used for to provide an entrance for disabled and people that cannot use stairs to get up. So here's the plan of that aggregation, trying to take advantage of each unit that's below and providing some outdoor spaces to those units that are stacked on top. And then here, the section showing a little bit of the structure that I was using to set these models on that seating. Obviously, that's not a flat surface. So rather than trying to come up with a unit that could maybe sit on these steps individually, it made more sense to make steel frames and then sit the modular units on top of those frames and the units above. This is just showing the circulation and access into those units. And then to finish everything up, just a few perspectives the project. Here would be from that kind of mid-level of circulation. And then on here, showing the community space out into a little bit of the elevation of that grouping. And then as a final image, showing that juxtaposition between what this site once was and possibly what it could be. Thank you.
Well, Ryan, that's really fun. That's really something. You know, what I really like about your proposal is that it maybe without you realizing it, I'm not sure, but I think you probably did, is that you've tackled the necessity for infrastructure for any of these kinds of projects that you would need to deploy, right? And when we think about prefabricated buildings, which we do a great many of, you know, we usually think about a kind of 50-50 split between the cost of the building and the cost of the infrastructure. And here you have a kind of infrastructure waiting for you. And that's quite an interesting thing you've taken on. The thing that I wonder about is how far you could take it. I mean, if you, you know, presumably these are pretty robust structures. They probably can take quite a bit of weight. I'd love to know how much they really can take. I'd love to know if you could make your housing more dense rather than make it so porous with so many courtyards. I wonder if you could start to really capitalize on all the concrete that's out there. And then, you know, the thing that you did is, because it's all on a raised, tilted plinth, you could arrange the infrastructure, the water filtration systems, the sanitary systems, electrical generation, you name it, underneath that those grandstands. Mm-hmm. So you have a really interesting prospect here for making something that is really kind of outrageous. And I think, but I think it'd be worth pushing it a little further in terms of the techniques, you know, because the real trick in this quick post-disaster employment is infrastructure. Because right, the minute you have a disaster, the first people who are pressured are the people who have to put the electrical and all the services back together, and you can't get service for months. So you might think about a kind of temporary, and this is what we looked at for the housing of ours that you looked at. We had deployable infrastructure. That is, you could roll in and you can buy these things and they can be stacked and so forth. You could collect sewage, you could store water, you could make electricity. And so you could station all that stuff underneath your grandstands and in fast order, right? So it's an interesting project. But I think you should push it a bit further.
Thank you.
I think James's comments are great. I really appreciate the project a lot. Ryan, it's pretty, it's tempting to just dive into it as an urban question of how do you take these suburban massive pieces of infrastructure and convert them into a project? And it makes me want to teach a studio just on this whole question, Ryan. Yeah. You know, like the mass timber is a great introduction to it, and the modularity that you were talking about, the transportation qualities, you know, it seemed well thought out. There was some things we could go back on and revisit that. But once you got to this level and you were talking about the stadium, I was like, no, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about the stadium as a convertible piece. And I mean, there's all kinds of things, and James brought up a number of them that were really thoughtful. But one of, you know, the density one really stands out for me. Once you've gone to the trouble to repurpose this stadium, and I guess you don't have seismic issues down there, because I'm thinking of locating those, you know, those modulars on these relatively thin slabs of concrete, WPA concrete. So that's a very practical issue. But, you know, you also are neglecting the ground plane to some degree, because that's actually an easier place to build, unless you tell us about this machine for living that's coming out from the understories of the infrastructure of the stadium itself, as was mentioned. But then there's questions of resilience that come back, and different way, which is the question of light and ventilation and how you harvest power for it potentially. I mean, I'm seeing all of these rimmed with solar panels and creating this kind of utopian sustainable community that can really sustain itself. And so you're collecting water underneath those in the bowels of the stadium. You're harvesting sunlight from above, but then also you might be planting trees in the center of the football field, where you're also regenerating your carbon that's happening in the center of this field, and it all becomes a lovely place for people to inhabit. But it's a working plantation that has a relationship back to this element. So I just want to congratulate you on that piece, and I would hope that you would take it into an urban analysis piece, because every city at least has one or two of these kinds of stadiums. I can think of one here, at least in the Seattle area, that's same era, same issues. You know, what do we do with this? And there's been competitions to hold about what to do with it. And I would think that increasing the density around this, creating almost like a Roman Colosseum where you have some real height to breadth proportions of the section, and would be a fabulous way to approach this, because I think it's for 106 units, you're way under densifying this major piece of infrastructure that could be a real example of an entire new utopian town outside or inside of all of our major cities in the States. I think it's really exciting, Ryan.
Thank you.
I think that going off of the urban strategy scenario, the one thing that seems to be needing a little bit more pressure put on it is the ability for the module to address a different range of inhabitation. So right now it's shown for the same scenario kind of repeated as if everybody has the kind of same amount of people living with them. And I think in some ways the use of your particular arrangement could allow for, you know, an L-shaped house or a pair of bars that are connected by a courtyard between, that are still setting up the same set of scenarios that you have here, but maybe give us some variety that would provide a kind of a community. So I think James' comment from the last one was that when these things get deployed, they often don't become redeployed or go away. And so the question is, how do we understand the community that we are developing from the standpoint of maybe a singularity or homogeneous deployment of these structures? And so I would push you to look at what types and what varieties your particular unit could allow for within the assembly that might kind of cover a larger breadth of family types and sizes and cultural backdrops. I think that would be helpful for this particular unit size.
Definitely. Yeah, related to that, Chris, is the types of spaces that you're creating between the units, Ryan? Because I find that to be maybe the more disappointing piece, where there's a need in all of ours, especially in small living conditions, to be able to go outside. And I see you have access to air and light, but you don't have that little private garden, which you could easily have in that configuration. Instead, you have this kind of scary void that goes vertically, that, you know, the little kids are going to be said, you know, don't fall down through the cracks there, dear. And I think there's some real opportunity there. And I can see in your big plan, you've got some overall areas at the entrances, there's some community gardens potentially, but just that little spot that's right outside my window to grow basil, you know, something like that is really valuable for these kinds of homes.
You know, it's just when Judith was talking about this business of weight, you know, the old how much does your building weigh, Buckminster Fuller business, you know, I couldn't help thinking about that a bit, because I mean, if you're building out of a material that soaks up carbon, well, that's, you know, it might make sense to use more of it, right? I mean, but the other side of it is that when you make weight, you make all kinds of problems for yourself. And I'm thinking about the Singapore, I was recently in Seoul for a housing conference, a modular housing conference. And the Singapore government was there, and they said, well, we refuse to make our buildings out of anything but concrete. And so we're making modular concrete buildings, and we're making them 50 stories tall. You can't imagine how much trouble they were having. They couldn't find cranes. They couldn't get foundations deep enough. They just had horrible problems. And, you know, when you make something heavy, you have to move it. You have to hold it up when it gets to the site. A lot of things come, a lot of negative aspects come with weight, I think, when you're building in these dense conditions. So I wonder about that. And I also wonder about the way we use CLT. I mean, if particularly in something like this, where you have point loaded conditions, and something that's been evolving from our research work at Pratt, we've been using CLT as this infill between steel frames to basically, I mean, among other materials, to look at ways in which that simplify connectivity, simplify the manufacturing process and the assembly process. This idea of hybridization, which goes counter to kind of the modernist ethic, right, of kind of literate material use, let's say, is really an interesting question with everything that's on our plate these days. Anyway, that's some thoughts that come from this.
I love the question of what does your building weigh, and from the standpoint that in terms of what Buckminster Fuller was using for his material happened to be aluminum when he said that statement. And within that context, yeah, the question is very pertinent in terms of the weight because of how intensive that energy consumption is for aluminum through the resource extraction and ultimately the refinement of that particular statement or building material. But I think from the standpoint of wood, I mean, I would love to see the question get asked from the standpoint of wood architecture without the context of how much maybe we depend on other material usages like steel or concrete. Because I think ultimately what we're dealing with in this instance is the need for weight to finally be on our side within the building context and the environment that we're trying to ultimately balance out within our typical uses of energy. So within the stadium setting here, I don't know what the structural loads would be, but ultimately I think it's a great thing to lean on concrete and ask it to do what it's supposed to do, which is to bear, which will be a lot of fun to push that around a little bit. And I would try to push that to the limit. And maybe that's actually a design directive for you, is to question what is the amount of weight you can use to actually prop up essentially a bunch of carbon as a sink within the context of an urban strategy. And that seems fascinating to me, particularly if we look at what some of the conversations that are coming out of Alan Organsky's lab now, which is the kind of urban context as a massive sink instead of thinking of it necessarily just a series of buildings. I think would be a great question for you to interrogate going into your maybe thesis year if you're doing thesis, or into something outside of academics as you leave the school.
Chris, it's really an interesting question. When we consider using mass timber buildings in the Northeast, and particularly if we're building passive houses, we have to add 10 inches of insulation to these wood walls. And then all of a sudden I'm going, why am I putting 4 inches of wood up and then adding 10 inches to it when I've got now a wall that's a foot thick, and if I made it hollow and I insulated it, I could make it more like a spruce goose than a Nordic stave church. So I don't really know that these things always are the right thing to do. I mean, I think and then, the other thing is the insulation that was shown in the last project, it's petroleum-based insulation, right? It's stuff that we shouldn't be using. So, I mean, buildings need to get thicker and lighter, from my point of view, in order to make sense, not denser with more petroleum products on them. So I really wonder, I think we always have to question these things. There's this whole bandwagon thing that we are so subject to, whether it's 3D printing or whatever it is. And we got to be very careful with this,
Jim, I couldn't agree more. And maybe it's being part of that bandwagon. Perhaps I should unpack some of these questions, because I think it's really easy to be confused. And I've had a lot of experience in our research and our, the book tour and just our teaching to the studios. There's been a lot of comments and criticisms and good, healthy debate within the passive community and within the mass timber community. One thing to keep in mind is scale. And when we talk about trying to create a carbon bank, the idea of putting as much carbon into stored carbon into the walls of these buildings is a really big advantage. But of course, you can do that when you start replacing something. And really, the typical mode for these smaller wood frame constructions, including the house that I am sitting in right now, is really just that. It's wood frame. It's light wood frame, which has much less mass, much less carbon sequestered in it, but also, is potentially even a cost savings for some of these. And whether you add petroleum-based or mineral wool, which is not petroleum-based insulation, it does account for that. But as you grow in scale, and this is the reason I volunteered, spent 2.5 years of my life on these ICC code committees, as you grow in scale, that's where the replacement happens between the mass intensive concrete and the less mass intensive mass timber. And it completely inverts that, because now you're faced with a larger building that can be built out of a much lighter material. And Buckminster Fuller's question is much more relevant, where it is a much lighter building by a considerable percentage versus a concrete and steel building, not to mention the carbon offsets, not to mention the fact that you're really storing tremendous amounts more carbon in there. So I think your criticism is really well taken at a lower scale, and it's debatable. And the advantage of it is that at a smaller scale is that you can create these building modulars very quickly, transport them in a structurally solid manner, which is much easier than doing light wood frame. And that's not necessarily my expertise, light wood frame modular, but there are some other advantages to doing the mass timber modular, but it isn't as, I think your points are very well taken at a smaller scale when you look at modular per modular on a light wood frame basis versus a mass timber basis. But it really depends on the goal of the project and the municipality to, is the goal is to hold as much carbon as possible. Mass timber wins all day long. But there's other goals, as we all know, for multiple scales of projects.
Susan, have you seen Richard Ryman's work at Rutgers, the CO2 sequestered concrete that's been developed this last couple of years?
I haven't. I've kind of turned my back on the concrete because I think there's a whole group of really good people. Kate Simon and our Carbon Leadership Forum is pressuring the concrete industry to get their act together and lower the carbon footprint of concrete. And I leave that to better minds than mine. I've been championing the mass timber, which has its advantages, but concrete is one of the biggest, as you well know. So people are working on that, and go more power to them.
You should take a look. The company that spun off is Solidia. It reduces carbon footprint by it's CO2 and train carbon. He cut the carbon contribution of concrete in half with one invention.
Well, and that's the exciting thing for me. Mass timber is putting pressure on the concrete industry in an enormous way. And if they can get their freaking act together, I'm all for it, James. But that's not my fight. That's not my battle.
Ryan, could you go back to your comparative perspectives for real quick?
Yeah.
There's one. Yeah, this one. I can't help but look at this and think that if the kind of post-COVID environment doesn't work out the way we all hope it does, that we might have a lot of stadiums that could refill this. And I agree with the call for increased density, and it does seem like you could even possibly wrap on the outside and do a whole bunch of things. But for me, this, particularly in New Orleans, the relationship between this open green space and the built high density is a very important and local question. It seems like the need almost across the board is to kind of increase the ability of the ground to manage its own water as it becomes more unstable in terms of how much we get and the ways we get it. So this center space seems like it would be almost the exact thing that the rest of New Orleans is calling for in terms of having urban centered wetlands that are scaled to neighborhoods. Like when you look at the economic mappings of New Orleans, you find these kind of major corridors with higher end houses and greater economies, and then these internal cores that are very poor. So they're kind of scattered almost like a grid through the city. And that's basically the layout you have here. So to begin to understand the need for New Orleans to balance, have a ratio of number of households to square footage of wetlands, and actually get ahead of this, choose what the density needs to be, for the amount of wetlands you can produce here and create a sustainable and resilient relationship between the human occupation and the natural world that is the infrastructure that comes in before the pipes and everything else that we have. I mean, I think that relationship would, I mean, for me, that could drive a whole project, just trying to understand how large of a small neighborhood you can establish a balance between natural systems and these kind of high density systems to get an ideal relationship.
Corey, I think that's brilliant. Have you seen these urban aquaculture gardens that have been, people are starting to put together? They're really fascinating things. So a combination of water retention and a complete ecosystem with fish and plants reinforcing one another.
Yeah.
Rooms.
Yeah. I mean, if we left New Orleans go and didn't try and keep managing it, it would probably take on that form.
I'm sure it would.
So this is a thesis project in the making, but Ryan is graduating. So maybe some of these themes could be taken on by one of the students that's not, maybe not in the stadium context, but the broader context. Before we go on to the next project, I kept thinking of Softy's habitat, which was problematic because of the concrete, but it had the kind of structural rigidity, and we would be eliminating about half the weight. So one could imagine that this kind of rigid wood modular construction piled up to create a kind of porous place with a variety of unit types and terraces. It seems like there's some potential there. So in any event, provocative discussion. And so I think our next one is Shinbo.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Chimbo. I'm doing the disaster housing based on the timber studio in Tulane. In my perspective, I would do the temporary housing for the residents in the flooded area, and then afterwards, will be donated. Those housing units will be donated to the homeless shelters, like local shelters. All right, but in Houston, there is kind of the temporary, the population for the homeless is going down. So it's kind of I will talk to you later, how we do it, afterwards. The second slide shows flood map in the South Gulf. So under the action of the storm surge, sea level rise, tropical storms, and hurricanes, the cities along the South Gulf face a higher possibility to be flooded. And also based on research from the University of Pennsylvania, 100 years floods will happen 1 to 30 years based on the temperature, the weather changed. This one is the map, shows the pine forest in South Gulf. Because of the location, we have very close to Mississippi, Alabama, and also Louisiana. We have abundant pine resources of this one would be the Sierra Timotarea. Also, the Sierra Timotarea, fabrication housing would be the future, which is very economic, convenient, and time-saving. This one is kind of the diagram to show the whole the route for the project. We got the material in the pine forest, also made the CRT panel in the factory, and we transported to another factory to make the modules. And I also choose the sports field to be my site. And after that, I will donate the housing unit to the homeless shelters. In this way, I want to say this one, we will take the CRT panels to be prefabricated in the factory, because we are doing the disaster housing. It's kind of like the emergency situation. So the time, the construction time is very important. So the prefabrication will save a lot of time. And also like, I see the sports field like in the campus or maybe in the other wares. So like the campus, like the schools were shut down like during the hurricane times. So we're gonna make it the full use of the space. So I will place the modules, the housing units in the sports field. Also like our disaster housing is very temporary. So like when the school is coming back, so we can move the housing units and donate that to the shelter house. This one, actually, basically I chose the site in Houston because like in 2017, this one is a flood map in the Hurricane Harvey. Also like several years earlier, in the Katrina's, the whole New Orleans is being flooded and nowhere to be like have a site to build kind of like disaster housing, which we may choose another site very close to New Orleans, but outside of New Orleans. But in Houston, it's kind of different. Like the dark blue one, the transparent dark blue is where the place will be flooded, and the red point is kind of like the high water point. So we can see the high water point was kind of like being reported to the government. So actually the site is kind of like a central of the map and also very close to the downtown. Like the site cannot support all the people, like the residents, like the housing is being flooded, but like they will be very easily to access from those sites to go to my site. And this one is kind of like an urban analyze about the traffic, which is very close to the highway. So like when we do the transportation of our modules, which one is very convenient. Also like the pink dash line is the pink dash line is the large rail in Houston. So like the people living there is very easily to access the public transportation system. So that would be very convenient to living there. This one is like the functional analyze, shows the restaurant, medical care, and also this one is shooting the site plan. Actually, I have this school is in Houston, is a high school. I think like some universities will also open in the flooded period, but in the high school, like primary school, they will be shut down. So like this one is a high school of law and justice in Houston, very close to downtown. And this one is my site plan, which is have the parking lot here. So like I do not need to spend some space to offer the parking space for the people living there. Just the parking lot for the schools will be enough for the housing units for the residents living there. And also like there is also some parking space along the street. Sorry. Next slide. This one is kind of like the site plan analyze. Like we can see on this side, the housing units is not like the vertical to the side, but it's kind of like facing the south. So we can get more solar or sunshine or something, but this is the second point. The first point is like, I put the housing units in these directions so I can get some green space. It's kind of like a semi-open space. So get some semi-open space. It's kind of like the connection between the public space and the private space. Also like the orientation, like the directions of the housing, and also it's based on the site like itself, because we have a parking lot on the right side in this way. So it's kind of like gathering space. A lot of people will be there. So I do not want like a lot of people like have a cross line with the eyesight. So I make the direction in this way. Also, I don't want the people living there like to have an eyesight across line. So I put the middle line of the housing units in this way. That's kind of like analyze about the housing units. And this one is kind of like a fly through video of my whole property. The right side is the parking lot. So it's based on the sport field. And like the building is in the facade would be the stair sliding. also like the housing units, it's not like attached to the road or maybe in the same line, like with like the place of the different locations can create some green space or also some gathering space for people living there. And like I think like when people living disaster housing or kind of like those kind of units can offer a space for people like gathering, talking, because they do not have a job or something or go to the school. So they have more free times. That's it. Next slide. Next slide shows showing the modules. This one is the first module. The first module and also the explode view. The first module plan is kind of very close to the like a hotel plan, which is very space efficiency. Also, in this way, it's kind of like sitting room, like the living room and the bedroom is very combined, because actually you can see that this one is kind of a mattress fixed on the wall. Like the daytime, it's kind of like living room, the sofa there, the coffee table, and on the night, during the night, the mattress will be laid down on the sofa and the coffee table. So like there will be bedroom. And this one is kind of like an elevation and the sections. Elevation and the sections. Actually, like for this module, we have just one window on one side because we do not have like a wall or like some panels to separate those space. So I think one big window is kind of like enough. This is kind of like a section perspective to show the active in this space. And this kind of like a wall to separate the kitchen and the living space, like to prevent the oil or maybe some water or something. Sorry. This one shows the fabrication of the module. Actually, in this one, using the 3 plywood as a wall and also the ceiling, and the 5 plywood for the floor. The 3 plywood would be like 17 panels. The total usage will be 1,224 square feet. And the width for the door, windows, and others will be 154 square feet. 3 plywood for the floors will be 5 panels. The total usage will be the 360 square feet. And the width would be 48 square feet. This one shows the fabrication, the process, the CLT, installation, and the finish. CLT for the ceiling and also like a roofing. Next slides. This one is kind of like a carbon summary for module 1, like the the whole units for the module 1 is kind of like 12 cubic meters for, of wood, and it's equal to 3 cars of the road for a year, and it's very similar to a home operate for 1 year. And the whole units for CLT weight would be like 30,700 pounds, and the cost for the module 1 would be totally be 78,000. This one is for module 2. Module 2 is kind of like different from the module 1 because this one for the family with 4 members or 3 members, but the size is kind of like a combined box with a big one and a small one. So the left side of the big box is very the same size of the module 1. This one is taken in consideration for the transportation. This one is kind of like a small box for the kitchen, for the dining room and the living room. The small box also offer a backyard because of the different size of different box. This one shows we have a backyard here and some public space, more public space here. This elevation and the sections, because this is prefabricated in the site, in the factory, and when transported to the site, and this kind of like combination will be finished in the site. So will be transported by bigger one and a small one, and a combination in the site. This one shows a section perspective for module 2. It's a fabrication of module 2 have 3 plywood for wall and ceiling, 27 panels. Total usage will be almost 2,000 square feet. The waste will be 500 square feet. The 5 plywood would be 7 panels for the floor, and the total usage will be almost 500 square feet, and the waste will be 24 square feet. It's kind of like a video for the fabrication process. The CRT panel, the insulation, and the outside finish. The big box, and this one is the small box, like the other side for the relatively more public space, kitchen or living room, and then combine inside.
Great.
This one is kind of carbon summary for module 2, and this one is almost like 16 cubic meters of wood, and will be 4 cars around a year, and will be a house operated almost 2 years, 2 homes operated 1 year. Actually, I think it's very similar to 1 home for operate 2 years. The CRT weight would be like almost 20,000. And the total cost will be the $60,000. And this is very detailed drawings for the modules. This one shows the connection between the detailed drawings in module 2, showing the connection between 2 modules, and also how the facade attached to the structure stuff like the CRT panels. And this one is using the section detail drawings, showing how the windows like combined with the CRT panel structure stuff. This one using the transportation. I have Googled a lot, and like the 2 biggest size for the trailer would be the 53 feet and the 48 feet. So like I just see like the module 1 and the big box of the module 2 have the same size, is the 26 feet. So there will be fit 2 modules in this trailer, and also like 3 little box in module 2 will be fixed in the small one, like the 48 feet. Sorry. And also like I Googled, because of my site is in Texas, Houston. So like based on the OMV, like Office of Motor Vehicle, like they have the single trip for house move will be extend like 20 feet.
You may want to start wrapping up so we have time to talk.
Okay, all right, got it. Very, very quick. This one is for the reuse for the housing, like from 2011 to 2019, the homeless people is coming down like 55%, and the HUD fund a lot of money in Houston. That's the reason why like the homeless people coming down. But like what I'm gonna say is kind of like a lot of homeless people become the homeowner people, like, but they have very close to the line, become poverty and the rich. So I'm gonna say like I can donate my house to the homeless to support the homeless people, and also can donate to some maybe cooperate with some companies to do some affordable housing, to offer the house to the people just to get a homeless, get a home from homeless. And this one is kind of the site because this is a homeless map showing the shelters, clothing, food, and medical, and also the big circles, like because of those like homeless point of very concentrated in the downtown space, and there's kind of like a big circle have some point of clothing, food, and this space can be do some shelter space. Thank you. This one is like a rendering for the final.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thanks, Shengmo.
Susan, I think you have your mute on.
Shengmo, I have to ask you, thank you, Corey. What would be different about your project if it was not in mass timber, assuming that the volume is the same, and obviously your wall sections will be different, but could you talk a little bit about like what what mass timber added to this project, because it's a really lovely investigation in how we address portable housing, temporary housing, and potentially housing for the homeless, in this case, Houston.
Yeah, it's kind of like very similar, but like because of the disaster housing, it's kind of like because about the time, and it's kind of like an emergency situation. So like the modules will be fabricated very quickly and moved to the side. So like the mass timber will be very like also the time saving for the construction. The second point is like based on our location, like very close to New Orleans, very close to Louisiana, Alabama, and we have a lot of pine forest resources. So this would be very economic. That's the 2 points for this site, for this design. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is the interesting thing that mass timber brings up. And as an architect, I experienced it directly by building this house, and especially this wall behind me, was that I realized the power of being interested in mass timber was as much about the carbon questions, but also about the prefabrication qualities. And if anything, that's become something that is completely turned our practice around and driven a lot of our research and our current practice to date in ways that I did not expect that mass timber would open up those doors, those other doors. And it's been fascinating to think about the power of mass timber in our profession, of prefabrication, excuse me, in our profession, to really revolutionize the way architects collaborate together with their contractors, with their owners, with their municipalities, and to think about speed all of a sudden becoming a design factor, which has tremendous value, not just economic, in very human terms, in how we relocate disaster-stricken communities and help our homeless populations, which are more and more critically precise. And I think that's a really fascinating aspect of the whole investigation to mass timber, which your project seems to be getting at the most. And I'm really, I just think it's a fascinating way to jump off this studio as the next potential studio, if you don't just do stadiums all the time, Judith, which is pretty exciting. It would be how the modular prefabricated, whether it's volumetric or flat pack, lends itself to transforming our built industry, our A&C industry, and our emerging professionals. And there's a lot of expertise on this jury that I would love your thoughts on that as well.
All right.
Well, Shambo, this is you touched on a lot of issues. I was going to just to build on what Susan was saying. The architects and the builders, they're one side of it. Then there's all the people who have to make this housing. And I was very interested in your first diagram that showed the surrounding forests and lines coming into the city in some way, right? And this product is being transformed from something in, that's naturally occurring, or I suppose farmed at this point. But in any case, it needs to be transformed. And there's a big question, where does it get transformed? What are the labor practices, machinery, training? Because it's the funny thing about this whole prefabrication thing, which Susan was really talking about, is it doesn't stop with a set of working drawings, or it doesn't stop in the architect's office or the engineer's office. It requires collaboration, that very deep collaboration. And once you start down that road, you can't help but think about the labor required to assemble it and how that labor is trained and its potential for transforming the labor practices and workforce potential of any neighborhood. So can you make your own housing? Can you imagine a prefab? I mean, could you have the CNC machine and a semi truck and load these panels in and make them on site? I mean, can you imagine how many ways you can empower people to make their own communities by using these kinds of techniques and making them, transparent, simple, and, affordable?
Yeah, Chembo,
I think that's a really, go ahead, Corey.
just following up on that, I want to just talk about your site selection a little bit. And I'm thinking about the last image that you showed.
Last image?
The very last image.
Okay.
And it's, you have this, what seems, and I might be wrong about this, but a real urban problem, the kind of homeless issue, and then you've certainly chosen one of the larger cities of the country, but the deployment of your pieces and the location you chose with the city in the background seems like your strategy has been largely a suburban one, that this is for large open spaces that in the perimeter of the city.
Yes.
And I just wonder about the mating of the larger site selection of Houston, and certainly it's a sprawling city, so that there is some argument that this kind of suburbanization happens inside the city. But the image that we have here seems to suggest it's on the outside, and so there's a kind of a political question with the idea of how do we deal with the homeless situation, which is exacerbated in an urban situation. I just wonder how far you've taken your thinking about that. In studios, homelessness is any kind of affordable housing is a really tricky thing because, I mean, housing just costs what it costs to build. And so a lot of the solutions to homelessness and affordable housing are ones of politics, economics, just social networks inside cities that allow certain services to be granted. So it seems like the large idea for you is this idea that you're addressing homelessness and ultimately affordable housing. So can you just talk about the choice of kind of being suburban and also how this addresses that issue?
Actually, like when I choosing my site, it's not like basically very exit on this side. I'm looking on like the sports field or maybe some open space, like in the Hurricane Harvey, like a lot of space being flooded. I'm looking for some space, maybe some water there, but not very flooded. Like we can do the constructions there. And for my whole project, I'm looking, I see like when I'm doing the prefabrication, like when the module in the factory, I have like cooperate with some companies doing the affordable housing, maybe with some shelters. So like, it's kind of like a whole process. Like, okay, I gonna give some housing units to you, but like before that, I made using these housing units as a disaster housing. But like, it's kind of like a whole process. And I see like the Houston government is kind of supported this housing units for the homeless or maybe affordable, and they can get a lot of fund. And also I think it's very easy to get some like tax credit, so like for a company to operate. So I think this way is like to put the housing units on the side for the disaster housing and to be the homeless housing. It's kind of like a whole process. It's not very like, oh, we finish this and we do that. So,
and that makes sense. I think a missing link, though, is how this particular urban environment receives that. And so even just the diagram to talk about,
right.
You know, what
I
is
always
that?
assumed that they would have to be moved because this school is going to need its field back.
Right.
and that was a question that wasn't really addressed and is perhaps not easily addressed. This morning there was a project that operated along the CSX rail lines, and the thought was that the modules could be moved back onto the train and perhaps relocated in a previously industrial site adjacent to a rail line somewhere along the Gulf Coast. And so I thought that, well, that makes sense, that there could be these kinds of sites that could accept this kind of, the communities might accept this kind of housing in some of those settings. But I think that maybe that wasn't something that Shembo had enough time to really wrap his head around.
Yeah, no, I understand. It does seem like Houston might be a particularly receptive city for this kind of thing, just the kind of hopscotch nature of the development as it goes out to the suburban sprawl.
And the lack of zoning.
Yeah, but just, I mean, even if you just have a placeholder in there, it's, I think by choosing Houston, you raise the question. And even a simple diagram to just say, this is how I think it could notch into this circumstance would take you a long way.
But Corey, I think you bring up an interesting point. The choice of form or planning, the planning choices that are made here, right down to the idea that the the units are rotated in a kind of attempt to disassociate themselves from the kind of collective, right? Have a kind of individual view that is singular in some way, right?
Yes.
There's a kind of funny approach here. I mean, in Shambo, you could have thought of this as communal in the sense that the units that you could perceive it adding up to a kind of identifiable precinct. But this has a kind of highly individuated character to it, where it doesn't, there's not a lot of concern about whether or not it adds up to much. And I think one of the things about homelessness is this kind of rootlessness, this kind of lack of focus and community that kind of comes with the territory. So I think that's something to really reconsider. I also think the infrastructure that would be necessary in the middle of this field would render it, rather expensive and inoperative in the end. So there's a very interesting question about communal structures that are made from transportable structures, right? I mean, there's a very interesting thing there.
Well, let's go on to the last project. Well, finish up comments and then we'll move on.
I was just going to make a comment regarding some of the statements that have been made by James in terms of infrastructure along the way. Mm-hmm. And now that we've seen 3 of these, it seems to me that there's a question that has to be answered in terms of the nimbleness or flexibility in the CLT architecture DNA and its capacity to be reassembled or reconfigured for a multitude of sites. And as the urban condition that is the kind of test bed for the deployment of these architectures, it seems like that the urban setting is going to be the thing that's maybe a little bit more fixed or difficult to deal with, while the CLT architecture DNA maybe gives us the moment of flexibility. And so I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around, the kind of age-old thing of, is the tail wagging the dog or is the dog wagging the tail? And the standpoint of how some of these are being deployed, I feel like that there should be some interrogation about the overarching urban strategy or overarching kind of infrastructural question that might actually inform why certain pieces are assembled in certain ways. And I think that's a conversation that maybe the last 3 groups could actually go get given the age drink over and say, what is it that the 3 of us as the 3 urban strategies can look at and learn from, and how our architectures might be able to be melded together for the intricacies of the urban setting that they're actually being deployed within. Mm-hmm. It seems like to me that there's some smaller scale stuff that's actually able to be brought into the stadium, while maybe some of the larger scale stadium stuff might be able to be deployed over here, and it may be able to give the kind of variation that may be deserved within these contexts.
It does seem like the site locations and the emergency temporary shelter requirements does suggest some version of a loose fit long life strategy that to match up to that infrastructure. I'm not sure what that is in each case, but
right.
All right.
Yeah, when we look at the 8 projects as a whole, and sadly, each group only gets to see half of them, they definitely fall into very different categories of what it means to stay or what it means to move. And I think that the grappling with that question sort of underlies what James was saying earlier about potentially multiple criteria and potentially competing ones that come to bear. But I think that that also makes it more engaging. To effectively, people have designed something that's about 500 square feet or 600 square feet or less. So the design of the module itself is only going to take you so far. It's both its materiality and its role in a longer term time frame. So we have a very different site condition in our last project, which is many things, but urban is not one of them.
Yeah. Hey, Judith, just one thought comes up. If there were 2 components to this effort, a kind of chassis or some substructure that contains all the infrastructure pieces could actually have built-in services and so forth, and it left you a certain amount of flexibility in terms of what you put on top of it. I mean, it'd be very interesting kind of hybridized sort of pre-constructed set of elements.
So it's more like in that sense, it would be more like a mobile home where the chassis lives with it and potentially moves with it.
Or no, or the chassis could be something that makes a platform, makes an infrastructure and all the piping and connectivity. You know, then you do what you want on top.
Urban proposition as opposed to a singular one.
Like, the open building systems. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. This is very interesting, this, when you start to think about it through the CLT lens.
Yeah. I mean, the nice thing about that is it offsets the infrastructure to a larger scale organization, like a governmental organization that could do that wholesale, and then you drop in the modules for living on top of that.
Yeah, nice idea. All right. So we have Zach and Anna.
Can everyone see and hear?
Yes. Yes. I'm going to mute myself.
All right. Hello, my name is Anna.
And I'm Zach.
And we are exploring permanency in our project in disaster relief housing. So just to start off, video, this is kind of articulating the kind of traditional framework of timber that I think we're all fairly familiar with. Timber being logged, brought to a factory, typically turned into 2x4s, and then eventually used for residential families or residential homes. And then that ultimately usually ends up as waste. And our project, on the other hand, starts off the same way, logging the same timber, and instead bringing it to a CLT factory as everyone else. And our project is different then in the sense that we're bringing it back to the forest, as you're just about to see. So there's a step between the actual CLT plant and the factory to make our unit into a volumetric unit. But essentially, we're going from the forest back to the forest to create a circular economy. Taking it one step back, the place that Zach and I really started with was a lot of natural disaster and climate change research. And as you can see from some of these statistics there, we were very alarmed by the number of people who are in vulnerable areas. And also, more surprisingly, the amount of time that a lot of climate change refugees spend not in their homes and potentially never return to their homes. So with that in mind, we began to question this idea of temporary, and as all of you have kind of already touched on through looking at other projects and bringing up these questions, we began to think that really there isn't a temporary solution. There is an immediate disaster relief solution that we wanted to address, but ultimately this is a permanent problem that is only expected to get worse. And bringing it specifically to the Gulf South and to Louisiana where we are, Louisiana and Florida, so coastal areas in the Gulf South obviously have a lot of worry with sea rise, subsidence, but the entire Gulf South will experience more natural disasters that are increasing in intensity and frequency. And another little caveat that we didn't necessarily focus on ourselves, but I think is super interesting, kind of related to this statistic, over 99% of the most socially vulnerable people live in areas unlikely to be protected from inundation. And that's compared to the least socially vulnerable group in the Gulf South. Only 8% of those people are in areas that are unlikely to be protected from flooding. So there definitely is this kind of like social environmental justice aspect to relief housing as well, that I think is really important to address and to think about.
So when looking at the individual module that would be sort of deployed as immediate response, we were really, sort of interested in this notion of expansion, and that sort of goes back to the idea of permanence, sort of how this module can expand over time and be used on multiple sites, whether it be deployed immediately for disaster relief, which is sort of what this unit would be used for, or sort of be placed on another site where sort of other configurations can sort of be shown. So the initial sort of idea behind this immediate sort of module was that It would be volumetric, and it would be assembled and fabricated offsite. So it'd be easily deployable in the event of a disaster. And the sizing of the module is 24 feet long by 12 feet wide. So you're able to get 2 modules for 48 foot truck bed, and some efficiencies come from that when you're immediately deploying the unit. And we're going to get into sort of these different configurations and how they can be arranged. But this idea of growth sort of guided this idea of having sort of these 2 CLT brackets with glazing in the middle that can, the glazing can be taken out, and that can be used as a circulation path. So think of growth sort of from the module, we sort of progressed from there.
So this is the actual plan of the unit. As Zach just mentioned, the windows are all floor to ceiling, so we're not wasting any CLT, and it also allows room for that growth and expansion that he also just mentioned. And we also wanted to have the entrance from the side, just so that the kind of front could have a little bit more privacy and allow for both ends of the unit to be fully used. In the middle is the kind of living and sleeping area. So in this first immediate iteration, that would be essentially a studio apartment. And so this is showing a little bit more of those CLT panels. Like I just said, they're optimized so that we're not cutting into any CLT at all. They're all just kind of those 2 U's put together with the interchangeable floor to ceiling wall/door units. We also put in, as you'll see in the other configurations as well, here it's just in the bathroom, those interior walls that are a little bit more flexible are all made of 2x4 studs. So to reduce the price, and also to allow for any and all plumbing, electrical, that sort of thing. This is just a little bit more of a breakdown of the materials in the wall assembly. Fairly typical, as I was just saying, those stud walls house the plumbing, and then the CLT is beyond that insulation, a water barrier, and then a rain screen, and our final finish on the end.
So, so our scenario sort of revolves along this timeline of sort of the current day sort of standard of disaster relief housing, sort of placing a unit sort of on site and sort of using it as an auxiliary unit while the resident rebuilds their house or gets back on their feet. And we were sort of interested in seeing how this module would be applied on sort of different scales and different densities. So this wasn't really the main focus of our project, but we were sort of interested in seeing how this unit would work in high density scenarios. But we felt like the most useful deployment of this unit would be sort of the single household, either single studio or large family. So I'm going back to sort of that volumetric shell and how the interior arrangement can be configurable with those stud walls. You can see here in this scenario, this is a large family with 2 bedrooms, and you can accommodate sort of larger scales of residents in the emergency.
But as we mentioned before, we wanted to provide the flexibility and adaptability for this module to be used in kind of those typical immediate disaster ways. But our ultimate goal was this kind of permanent community. And that also relates to that very first idea of a circular economy, to make the use of CLT a little bit more affordable and viable. Our idea is to create this kind of system of permanent living communities that kind of work in tandem with CLT factories and that industry, so that they both kind of become a bigger thing in the Gulf South. So we're looking at Geneva State Forest as a site for doing this. And as you can start to see here in this diagram, taking perhaps those immediately used modules and transporting them to this more permanent site and establishing a community there. So this is sort of a rough site plan of what that looks like with the aggregation. So the two main things that are driving here are kind of the requirements of the household themselves. So if that studio apartment would just work for the couple or the single person who is displaced, then it can remain just as that single module, or as we're about to get into, that unit will be added to. And the other main thing that we were thinking of, and this kind of brings in Geneva State Forest as our site a little bit more, was working into the forest management system that's already in place. So Geneva State Forest has a 75-year rotation of work units. And so I guess talking about like lifeline, timeline of buildings, that kind of fits into this idea of how long could a residential home be here. So ideally it would fit right into that timeline, and we would work within their kind of demolition, clearing, and growing of new wood.
So this animation is showing sort of that that growth, bringing those volumetric units from a more urban site or a site maybe affected by by coastal flooding, and then seeing sort of that user end growth. And we're going to get into this later, but we have sort of a kit of parts that the residents can sort of add spaces onto their house to accommodate different scales of residents.
So this plan again is the same volumetric nucleus as we showed before. And then this is starting to get into the additions. So as Zach just mentioned with the kit of parts, this middle piece would be a flat pack addition. We'll come back and talk to that a little bit more. And then the full aggregation would have another volumetric module flipped on the side. So this is an elevation of just that one volumetric with the flat pack, and then that full expression, and then a section also, and the full expression. This elevation is of that kind of front entrance. So for the volumetric, the flat pack, and the full expression once more. And then for the flat pack, as we mentioned before, the idea behind this was kind of to allow for some flexibility in price. So we did some cost estimates, and the biggest thing for the flat pack was the price of labor. So we kind of even thought of it as like potentially something that could involve the whole community, being that it's in this forest site, that they could play a hand in the construction and expansion of their own home. And then also we wanted to maximize and optimize the CLT used here. So it has the same logic of the openings being used as doors for kind of that next expression and being floor to ceiling so that we're not wasting any CLT. The roof is also made out of CLT, and then it has glulam columns coming out on the exterior. So those two are separated, so there's no thermal bridging. And this again is of the wall assembly. So it's kind of the same system as the volumetric.
And sort of the main programmatic difference between sort of that flat pack module and the volumetric is the volumetric module houses the kitchen and the bathroom, which sort of have wet wall components. So keeping that in the volumetric, sort of simplifying that, making it efficient for immediate deployment was important. But for expansion of bedrooms and living space, this is something that didn't need as much infrastructure as bathrooms.
So these are just some kind of more final images now. So section perspectives, and then the whole site. And that's our presentation.
Very nice. There's something about the bucolic setting and the community build that it's got a real Usonian feel to it. The kind of the rise of the middle class here again. This work was quite nice. All the drawings were very very much appreciated. One thing in particular that has come up a little bit, but in yours it was strong. The studies that you did incidentally to develop the possibilities for higher density. Thinking back to some of the ones we saw, the kind of single greatest characteristic of the CLT is that its enclosure and structure, that it comes with all of its other advantages. It has this robust ability to carry weight, and so once you build these modules, you can stack them up. And at some level, I mean, temporary emergency housing, maybe not, but to not think about it a little bit in terms of going up multiple floors seems like leaving something on the table that shouldn't be left. So I appreciate those speculations.
Yeah, I want to echo those comments. Corey, I think Anna and Zach, this is a really sweet project. It's very well designed. It has a very convincing corporality about the materiality and the volumetric relationship between the spaces of the small units. And I really particularly appreciate the systemic analysis of the forest, of understanding or trying to understand at least the complexities of forest management, which has been a whole other aspect of this journey of CLT and mass timber for us in our practice. But it's really a very thoughtful project. I have a couple of questions, but the idea just generally of understanding the forest resources, connection to the urbanism and displaced populations, and then repopulating them back within the forest population is a really sweet, especially as it knits itself into the replanting and management of those existing plantations that we're looking at here. It's a little more of a challenge to imagine how this would work in this particular rendering, although it's a very beautiful rendering. But so I guess my questions were, first of all, I didn't quite understand who's living here. Are these people in New Orleans who have been displaced and in some similar community, an urban community? And then are they being moved out here, relocated here? Or are these rural populations that are needing places to live as well because of other disaster related? And that was a related question, is where are these being fabricated? Are they off-site in the New Orleans area and then brought back? And I guess my third question is a broader question about your goals of carbon relative to forest management, which I'm sure you've thought about this, and so I'd like your thoughts to go into depth more on this. But as you take trees out and create them into boards, which create mass timber panels or glulam columns and beams, then it's the carbon cycle is dependent on replanting those trees. And granted, they can be planted in different ways and more efficient ways. They don't have to go back into the same spot, but there's a cyclical nature, which that's where we get a lot of the carbon uptake, is by replanting 1, 2, or 3 trees for every tree that's harvested out of the forest. So how are you accomplishing your goals with that when you're actually locating the houses in this awesome 75-year cycle? I love that idea. But how are you really accomplishing those when you're also occupying key planted areas that need those trees to be replanted in them? So 3 questions I had, sorry.
I think I can answer that first part. I don't think we really framed it as clearly as we could have, but sort of looking at the forest site, we were sort of looking at the projections of coastal flooding and looking at potential sites or variety of sites that would sort of migrate people from the coast more to inland. So sort of returning sort of back to the forest. So this is, I'm sort of assuming that the people living here don't have a site to go back to after a disaster, so that's sort of the framework or the demographic that we were sort of looking at.
Okay. And to expand on that too, I guess thinking of the uber permanent, how this idea could evolve as well, that I think would be a permanent solution. And getting into this idea that we talked about before of kind of creating this new CLT Gulf South economy in the way that we think would make the most sense. Part of our idea also was that this kind of system of communities could be replicated in other forests, so that if, hopefully not, but if the way of the world gets to such a point that there are so many displaced communities that it's not just people living on the coast, that it is people who have their homes destroyed by wildfire or a tornado, all of, horrible things. But if that becomes more and more of an issue, then this already is a solution in place. There's already CLT factories and volumetric modules being made that can kind of help out. As for, I think your second question about where would be fabricated, we didn't super look into that as well, but I believe there is a factory also in Dothan, Alabama, where the CLT kind of manufacturing faculty is that we could use for the volumetric modules. So I think just our idea was keeping the amount of transportation as small as possible. So ideally have
People
all.
that are not it's not the trees are not moving, the lumber is not, the CLT panels are not moving, it's the people that are moving from the coasts into the forest.
Right.
An interesting inversion of how we usually take the resources out of the forest and bring them into the cities. You're bringing the people to the resources. Yeah.
Right.
It does raise a question about, if you're taking coastal cities and starting to distribute them in a distributed model like this, the area that it's going to take up will be vastly superior to the density that you got in an urban area. So there's as these catastrophes increase and we're evacuating from our coasts, this might turn into your 3-story ones might be called for.
Right. Right.
Maybe this is a good time to talk about this notion of collaboration in our efforts to do really touch any aspect of rebuilding or dealing with our cities and the construction issues and labor issues that come with it. The idea of building in a forest like this carries with it a number of really sensitive environmental conditions. And we've found that certain species of trees, for instance, can't survive the removal or the lack of density of trees. They're a complete ecosystem. When you start to weed them out, the rest die because they have to be tended very carefully. And I mean, how would you know that as an architect? You couldn't, right? I mean, it's too much. So, and then you have this business of, well, how do you really assemble, or where does the kind of whole course of manufacturing and material flow and all these things, how does that take place? How does assembly take place? How do you deal with the foundations, the infrastructure? We've talked about that. Well, the reality is, I mean, there's probably 10 specialized bodies of knowledge in each one of those things. And I think it used to be, so for instance, when Judy and I went to architecture school, they basically thought they could teach you to build an entire building while you were there, they teach you to do everything. You could engineer every component of it. Well, today that's virtually impossible. Information, knowledge, complexity has transformed what we do. So for you to really take this on, you'd have to, and I don't think it's just this, I think it's any project really these days, but anyone that has aspirations like yours, you really have to look at the bodies of knowledge that you'd have to touch on and collaborate with in order to be successful in it. We have a project that's rather similar right now in a northeastern forest, and I started off by looking at a Danish landscape hotel. It's called Juvet, Juvet, and I wondered. I mean, its buildings are set between trees, and I looked at it. I thought, how in God's name did they manage this? Well, the Norwegians aren't the same as we are. Mm-hmm. They went in with these individual sort of carpenter craftsman types, and they drove by hand little 2.5-inch pipes into the ground in a densely spaced pattern, and they hand assembled a prefabricated system around the trees. And they did it in such a careful and deliberate way, it was unimaginable. If we were to try to do it here, it would be thousands of dollars a square foot. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. But that's this whole business of how you interact with the culture you're dealing with, and how you really deal with the complexity that's inherent in your undertaking. I think it's always a really interesting issue.
James, that's why I love this project, because it really brings up these issues of the rural communities versus our urban communities. And that's one of the things that has fascinated me in this mass timber journey over the last 7 to 10 years in our practice, is how much we are symbiotically related in ways that we as urbanites think that we're kind of kings and queens, I suppose, of the urban situation, but in fact we depend greatly on these rural communities. And then in retrospect, the rural communities feel abandoned and demoralized and not valued. And I think this is an opening, as we've talked about a lot, to bring those communities closer together. And this project is perfect to begin to talk about those questions. I love the examples of the pipes in the ground, but is all about this, where there used to be perhaps timber economies in the Pacific Northwest, especially, that would have supported this kind of project. There are potentially communities in Arkansas, in the South, the rural South, that are building to recreate this infrastructure. But the problem we're confronting in the Northwest here is that there's a loss of hope and a sense that the CLT could save us all. But in fact, it's still so slow moving that within the lifetimes of the knowledge of the displaced timber worker from the timber wars of the early 1990s, that knowledge will probably be lost forever, because their children and grandchildren have now moved to the cities and are Starbucks baristas, et cetera. And it's a very difficult human question that is also on the other foot, where you're bringing displaced urbanites out of already a traumatic situation of displacement, and then bringing them into the rural environment, where there's very different ways of survival and of living that are completely different, unless it's kind of set up for you in a kit of parts, and it's completely just press and play, go forth. The difficulties of adapting to even the serenity and the things that we idealize as architects about living within nature actually creates really detrimental possible things within communities, within families, because it's so radically different from isolation aspects from living in the cities that we're all, or as urbanites, used to. And I think this is a great project because it brings up those issues to the fore. And I know you guys have thought about it and talked about it in the studio, Judith. And I really appreciate I don't see this as being necessarily realistic, except in a very iconic and kind of beautiful $1,000 a square foot way, James. But nevertheless, it brings up the possibility of what might happen in these settings.
So that's interesting. Yeah, I'm sorry, Chris.
No. Go ahead.
Well, I just very interested in this loss of hope that Susan brings up. I mean, that's a very interesting. I mean, that is a kind of pervasive condition in a lot of ways, right? So, and I always think of Seattle and the Pacific Northwest as one of the few places that's able to get its act together and kind of act communally. But it's interesting to hear that. So,
well, the city has not lost its hope. It's the rural communities that are about this same distance, about 250 miles away from the cities, which is surprisingly close to our urban environments. It's only maybe a 2 to 4 hour drive, but there is a radically different economies. And I think the closest thing maybe, Forks, Washington with Twilight Zone. If you've ever seen actual pictures of Forks and have been there, it's a tiny, really sad town. And those are people that are our colleagues that moved out of Capitol Hill out of downtown Seattle, central Seattle, and moved to try to help those communities survive. And it's been a fascinating aspect of this journey for me to experience as a professional.
It seems like maybe from the standpoint of this studio's contribution to the wood discussion at this point is that it is bringing up a set of interesting questions for the Gulf Coast. And I think that centering around the logistical nature of all the components that go into making this architecture actually come to be, or maybe even the kind of support mechanisms that would even give a rise to this architecture within this region where it doesn't exist, are the biggest kind of unanswered questions we're all searching for here. Thus, I think for this particular project, when we are looking at the use of local material for serving a local purpose, I think I would push you guys to ask the question that maybe needs to be pushed ahead further with, which is to maybe break down a little bit of the system that is hard to overcome. And I think those in Alabama, if I'm not mistaken, might be dealing with this right now, which is that the amount of infrastructure that it goes into getting a plant like that up and running and supporting its enduring success is going to take a significant amount of contributions from its local community to use its resources. And from the standpoint of what your project may offer, it could say that the future of this looks a little bit more rough in a way, and just to get it going, right? To get the kind of language built up, use the local knowledge set. And so it may take an untrained maybe set of skills in certain instances like industry, and maybe go back to a little bit more localized craftsman skill where they might be in charge of building these things locally that are based on loosely the idea of CLT, like dowel laminated timber or even nail laminated timber structures that aren't so dependent on enormous beds and glue systems and processing, that might get these panels up in the air and show them as an example for what can happen to kind of jumpstart this type of community, which will do one thing, which I think is also another logistical problem for our country, which is to cut down on the amount of road time that these panels and the structures see. But it seems like that is also one of those moments that as soon as it hits the road, I
think you hit your mute. We can't hear you anymore.
We lost you, Chris.
Just when you were getting to the good part.
Chris, stop. We lost you.
How do we get him back? I think he has to do it.
It doesn't look like his mute's on.
Yeah, I could mute him, but I don't want to.
Chris, we lost you. You may have to log back in.
Were you wearing earphones or something? Did they run out of batteries? That's happened to me.
I think he's
he
just
just
trying
said
to
his phone
increase the
quit. He needs
suspense.
to call back in. He just chatted.
On his topic, it is interesting to think that part of the forest management service might be to have these low-tech CLT manufacturing facilities, and they could both build out the infrastructure for park systems, but also potentially sell these, like as they build them and mount them on piers, they could be shipped out as people need them or want them. And there could be some kind of local economy built around that idea.
So this thing that the Pacific Northwest has looked a lot at, and we've had a couple of design studios at the UW look at this, is where students go out and they build their own CLT panels. And it's so, it seems on the surface really awesome, but what happens is if you're going to build at scale, it has to be regulated. And under the ICC, it has to go through that regulation of the PRG 320 under the APA process, the American Plywood Association. And it's really disheartening to realize how much of this infrastructure to build the CLT factory is about a $30 million minimum infrastructure. And then it only creates maybe 5 to 10 jobs out of that because it is automated. It's super cool. But it does take, it's a little bit of, it's very easy to romanticize, sort of the barn raising aspect of mass timber, especially in these rural economies. But there's some very high tech qualities which can be worked to your advantage, where these become really great rural jobs for kids of the lumberjack, so to speak, to stay, because they're basically software based. And that's what really has gotten the politicians, I think, on both sides of the aisle in this country excited about mass timber, because it does address these really critical areas of rural and communities and their respective needs.
It does seem like that overlap with governmental organizations that could finance some version of that and maybe manage the code system as they must, so that the forest management, as that becomes a more refined system for super long term, that there might be a way to put things into production. It's exciting.
Well, it seems like we're starting to talk about big issues. So maybe a few more comments. I appreciated, well, of course, I hugely appreciate all your time and a really provocative conversation. Susan touched on the fact that, and I've been thinking about this, how am I going to build on this next time I teach it, which is a year from now? And we're not going to address that conversation right now, but you've all given me a lot to think about how I might move this forward.
Yeah, I want to say one more thing about this project before, and I think we're moving on, but it reminded me a lot of what Chenbo was trying to do in terms of homeless populations. And it just struck me that this is the kind of situation that if it was tied with services, that instead of having refuges for the homeless population in cities, which it still remains a kind of somewhat overbearing circumstance, the idea that there could be a kind of temporary respite in a place like this, where you would get services, for addiction, for mental health issues, for financial education, for any number of things that might put people on a better foot to go back into the environment they came from. That this idea of a park system, it might just be an outgrowth of the governmental service system, the park system, and then this place where there's some kind of refuge. I do realize, Susan, your point that sometimes leaving an urban environment that you're used to, the rural condition can be as scary as an urban is for someone who grew up in a rural condition.
Corey, it's a funny thing. So we have we've been struggling with homelessness for many years in New York, and one of the things we found is that if you take a person from the Bronx, you put them in a homeless shelter in Queens or in Brooklyn, they may never have been there before. It may be the first time they've ever visited Brooklyn or Queens, and taking them out of their neighborhood is such a radical displacement that it exacerbates the problem. So it's really, it's a tough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have 3,000 acre property that I was doing a previous studio on. The program it's owned by a billionaire philanthropist, and she can do anything she wants, of course. And hopefully, I would like to engage her in the CLT conversation. But the program that we picked was for a camp for urban youth to come out into nature in the summer. And it strikes me that Anna and Zach's project could really turn into some kind of retreat for supporting a more symbiotic relationship between rural communities and urban communities.
With Susan's comments, I think, are on the relationship between mass production and handicraft or job creation. That's a really interesting problem, right? And it's true in all forms of prefabrication. The advent of robotics and all of this stuff strips jobs away. So what we've been working on is this kind of putting things in a couple of different caches, if you will. That there's tremendous utility in the kind of rapid fabrication of these kind of primary structures, and then what we've been trying to do is break them down so there are components that can be added to them, customized, that you get a kind of core structure that satisfies the need for fundamental housing structure, and then you do this kind of Charlotte Perriand thing. You try to engage kind of craft, structure, customization, transformation through design. I mean, you design these things, and not to make them undesigned necessarily, but to create two different bodies of job creation. One that's extremely limited and has to do, well, it's not so limited, it has to do with robotics and software writing and architects and all that stuff. And the other one that has to do with much more hand-based creation and all of that, It seems to me we can combine these two things. I mean, we don't have to keep them quite so separate.
Well, that's a slight variation on what I suppose Aravena did in those projects for low-income housing in Chile, where you build half of it and you let everyone build the rest.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing about this particular project is that these small-scale modules could act as kind of cores for the the kind of construction of the field construction of other pieces around them. So it's got, it has a lot of intelligence.
All right, I guess I'll stop sharing. It's funny because we looked at that project and we also were thinking a lot of the idea of like camp and community making in terms of camps. So I think that came through.
It has that beautiful quality. We started the semester with we spent a short period of time doing some readings, one of which was William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, the part about the relationship between the forests of Wisconsin and the city of Chicago, and the sort of symbiotic relationship between city and the rural economy. But of course, it's always been a difficult relationship, and it's even increasingly difficult today with these new forces. Well, I've kept you longer than I intended. I know sitting in front of a Zoom screen for more than 2 hours is challenging, having done it daily for the last few weeks. I want to thank our reviewers. I am deeply grateful. And as I think I said in the morning session, the only good thing about having a review this way, as opposed to bringing you to New Orleans, is that it's maybe easier to gather a particular group that might not have been able to make the trip. But I really hope that the next time I see you all, it's in Richardson Memorial Hall in New Orleans, and we can end our afternoon with a drink at the Columns or wherever. That would include the students too. Unless anyone has any other final comments, I guess I will suggest we say goodbye, and then I'll tell the students, I'll send you a note. I think what I'd like to do is maybe set up personal times to just chat and talk about what you're thinking about and what your plans are, and what you're thinking about for thesis, what you're thinking about for jobs, and congratulate you on completing a successful semester. So thank you, guests. I'll follow up with personal notes to our visitors, but I am deeply appreciative of your time.
Thanks for
Thank
the
you very
invite.
much, Judith.
Nice to meet everyone.
Thank you all, students.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Great job.
Thank you, guys.